So we're very happy to have with us today two excellent speakers, Professor Ana Maria Herrera and Professor Anthony Crean. So Dr. Herrera is a professor of economics at the University of Kentucky and is currently a visiting scholar at Universitat Pompeu Fabra. She earned both her BA and MA in economics at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota and her PhD in economics at the University of California, San Diego. Herrera was a Repsol YPF Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School in 2005-06 and conducts research in macroeconomics, energy economics, and applied econometrics. Her work has been published in the Journal of Monetary Economics, the Journal of Financial Economics, the Journal of Applied Econometrics, and the Energy Journal. So let's welcome Professor Herrera. And I'll also introduce Professor Crean. He is a Gatton Endowed Professor in Economics at the University of Kentucky, he's right here, and currently also a visiting scholar at Universitat Pompeu Fabra, whose research focuses on information and strategy in industrial organization and international trade. Previously, he was a professor in economics at Michigan State University, Fulbright professor at Charles University in Prague, and visiting scholar at the Australian National University, Boston College, and University of Sydney. He received his PhD from the University of Virginia in 1991 and has published in, among others, Journal of Economic Theory, International Economic Review, European Economic Review, Journal of International Economics, Journal of Industrial Economics, and Games and Economic Behavior. So again, let's welcome Professor Crean. Okay. So as you can see, the session is being videotaped. It will also be posted on the YouTube channel of AUB as of tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila, for the introduction and especially for the invitation to all of you for being here. It's been great getting to Lebanon finally after having so many Lebanese in Colombia and growing up around Lebanese people. So it's great, and it's great to see my former graduate student, Mohammed, here too. So this paper is a fresh paper, as Leila was trying to get us to send her the paper last week. She finally got the paper on Friday. So I would mostly welcome comments, whatever you have, because we're just still working through things, and so that's the time to get comments and change things. It's joint work with a former student of mine who's at Allegheny College now, and so just without further ado, let me get started. So as you know from what the process that you have gone now through in Lebanon, if we think about financial resources, right, when you think about allocation of financial resources, that's one way in which we can get transmission of shocks, but also amplification of shocks. We can think about amplifying monetary policy shocks, but also amplifying other type of shocks. And so one of the things that we have seen is that when you see financial crisis, before a time of financial crisis, you have this problem where you have misallocation of financial resources. So let's think about the crisis of the US, right? You have lots of these loans that were going to, in mortgages, right? And there were people who were not going to be able to repay lately, and where we were not being very careful about screening the mortgages. The other thing that we know is that if we think about financial crisis compared to other type of crisis, we know that they have very long-lasting effects on the liquidity, and this is high liquidity across firms. And we would be particularly worried if this also affects long-term credit, because that's going to affect the abilities of the firms, right, to invest. So that's the other thing that was prompting us here. And when we started thinking about this, we also started thinking, well, we're going to look at credit flows, and I will explain in a moment what I think about in terms of flows. But the question here is, okay, so how should policymakers respond to changes in credit conditions? And when I'm thinking about changes in credit conditions, right, we have after a financial crisis, one of the things that policymakers could do is they could start to evaluate, for instance, a financial boom, right? Before we hit the crisis, these policymakers should be thinking about how dynamic the credit market is, how flexible so this credit is being reallocated, which are the firms that are getting the credit, are these firms that are maybe high default probability firms, are these low default probability firms, are these firms that maybe have more efficient way of investing, right? So that's one of the questions that pops up when we're thinking about this. Another thing that we can think about this in this case is we're thinking about this recovery from crisis where you have very low credit, right? So I had been told right now that, for instance, in Lebanon, we're having the banks that are not offering that many credit lines to the households. But in the case of the US, it was the same thing, right? We had this financial crisis. There were not only few lines of credit for the households, but also for the firms, right? There's been a lot of research done from the point of view of the household. So what we wanted to focus on is wanted to focus on the firms. But there's two different aspects you could think about from the point of the policymaker. So you can think from the point of view of the firm, you have creation of credit versus destruction of credit, right? So from the point of view of the firm, you could have that. And maybe what the policymaker should be doing, right, before the crisis, say, okay, are these firms you have this creation of credit being very high, right? Should we be worried because the creation of credit is high? Or should we be worried also because we're destroying lots of credit lines? Okay, that's one thing. So there's two different aspects, which if we were looking at the net change in the credit line, amount of credit that the economy has, we wouldn't see it, right? So we need to look at creation and we need to look at the destruction too. So should the policymaker just worry about creation and say, well, after the recession, should we try to channel resources so that the creation increases and not worry about destruction? Or maybe what the credit policymaker should do is say, well, no, what we're worried about is the destruction margin. We have lots of firms that have less credit than what they had before, and they're reducing the amount of credit. Let's don't worry about the creation part, right? You could think about both of these things. What's the other thing that we're thinking about here? So we were thinking about monetary policy. And so the question initially in this paper was, okay, when we have a monetary policy shock, does this change in monetary policy actually intensify this dynamic process of reallocation? So we know that it should change the net amount of credit, but we don't know whether there's more reallocation happening at the same time. Is there a lot of creation and a lot of destruction? The way to think about you're creating credit and you're destroying credit, right? If we look at the net, we could say, how could I get a 2% increase in net credit? I could get a 10% increase in net credit because credit is increasing by 4%. That's the creation. And it's dropping by 2%. 4 minus 2, that's 2%, right? That's a market that maybe you say is not that dynamic, but I could get it by a 10% increase in creation versus at 8% destruction, right? That's a much more dynamic market. So that's another thing that we want to look at. Okay, so then we start thinking about unconventional monetary policy. And we think, okay, when we were thinking about after the financial crisis and the US had to resort to unconventional monetary policy measures, what was the effect of these unconventional monetary policy measures on credit flows? And that's a particular question we're going to look into now. So if we look at December of 2008, when we look at December 2008, the federal funds rate basically hit the zero lower bound. That's what the ZLB stands for, is just the zero lower bound, right? And at that point, what did the Federal Reserve had to do if they wanted to foster more liquidity in the credit market, but basically to go to unconventional policy measures, okay? So then, by November of 2014, if you look at the amount of the assets that the central bank had, the Federal Reserve had, we're basically at the point where we have up to 4 trillion of mortgage-backed securities, agency debt, and long-term US treasuries. So it's a huge increase, right, on the assets of the central bank. So the question of this paper, what is to answer is, what type of firms were affected by these unconventional monetary policy measures? Let's focus on this part.
By unconventional monetary policy, do you mean quantitative easing?
We're going to think about quantitative easing, the Operation Twist, and then the next quantitative easing. But this also might include the forward guidance too. We don't have for now a way to separate between the two. So,
but my next question is it unconventional after a recession to basically lower interest rates, try to lower interest rates down to zero?
Okay. We could argue whether that should not be, we could think about not being unconventional. we're going to say in this case, when I'm going to refer to unconventional monetary policy, is any policy that allows the interest rate, the shadow rate, to go below zero. That's what it's going to be. Okay, so just to give you an idea of the importance of credit in the US, if you look just right before the recession, what was happening, right, is you look at the ratio of the total debt to equity in the US, you see this huge increase, right, in the total debt to equity. So most of the external finance, right, was mostly external finance through that and not equity you have in the firms. And then after the recession, this still starts dropping, right? If you think about what type of credits these were, like if you think about, well, part of it was mortgages, but the other thing that we have seen during the last times is we've seen a huge increase in commercial paper. But again, here during the recession, you have a dip on everything, right? So I just dip on every different type of credit. Okay, so if we think about what is so particular about credit, so why do we focus on credit or not equity? Part of it is going to be because we have the data, right? But part of the other thing is going to be because if you think about credit from the perspective of the firm, right, is if you look at this credit from the perspective of the firm, this is the main form of external finance for firms in the US, right? So that's what's going to allow them to do lots of the long-term finance if you think about long-term credit, but also it has very distinct costs and benefits from other things like equity. Okay, so that's why we're thinking about it. I'm going to go very quickly over this. This is just to say our paper doesn't stand in the vacuum, right? There's lots of related literature in here. There's lots of other people that have been looking at these questions. They have looked at financial frictions and misallocation of resources. We can think about monetary policy effects also on borrowing firms' cost, on the lending institutions. We've done previous work on credit reallocation. What people have not looked at is in particular what is the effect of this unconventional monetary policy, which is what this paper does. So let me get to the data. First thing that we do is we basically get data from Compustat North America. We're going to use quarterly data. This covers from the first quarter of 1974 until the first quarter of 2017. And what we're going to do is we're going to compute these credit flows using the same definitions that we had in our previous work with Raul Minetti and Marek Koller. And so how do we do this? Or let me tell you first about advantages and disadvantages of using this data. So one advantage of using Compustat is that you have a very long period of time, right? So we have data starting on the 70s up to 2017, and that allows us to look at the dynamic process of reallocation. So that's a good thing. What's the other thing that is good about the Compustat data is that we can partition firms by groups. So we can look at things of like, okay, are different type of financial characteristics of the firms important? So can we split them, for instance, in firms that are more financial dependent versus the ones that are less financially dependent? Small versus...
Question. You think limiting the sample to publicly traded firms is an issue?
I will go, yeah.
Okay.
So that's a problem, right? Because there's going to be the larger firms, usually are going to be older firms.
Right.
The only thing is we're going to think, okay, if this affected this firms that much,
Yeah.
the effect for if we were going to smaller firms should be even larger, right? So
We have Orbis data for, do you know that? We, for Russia and Turkey, we bought Orbis data where we have the entire almost universe of firms.
that would be great.
Yeah,
Then you can look at all the, yeah.
yeah.
That would be great. That would be a great question to say, okay, well, and then you can compute credit flows for Turkish data and also for, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a way to merge this firm with data, with private data also for smaller firms. That's not something we have done yet.
Yeah.
So that's the disadvantage, right? So we have just only publicly traded firms, so it's going to exclude especially the really small firms. So let me think about definitions first. That's another thing is when we're thinking about debt here, really what we're thinking about is we're thinking about the credit reallocation across the firms. We're not looking at the bank side. Okay, so there's work that already Chen Garibaldi, who had used data from the Federal Reserve, where you can look at the reallocation at the level of the bank, which I assume that's data, for instance, that the Bank of Lebanon would have and would be interested in looking at, right? But this is from the point of view of the firm. The other thing that we have is we can actually decompose long-term data and short-term debt. And the importance of that is, right, if you think about short-term debt usually is just going to finance the period of time between the firm's, well, like the operational cost that the firm has to incur and whenever they get the payments, and so they have to pay for that, for wages, for instance, versus when we think about long-term debt is usually what finances investment and would allow you to grow, right, get some idea of growth. Other thing that we're going to do here is we're going to have all forms of debt because that's what we can get from Compass Debt. The only thing that we're going to exclude is we're going to exclude account payables to suppliers. Not because trade credit is not important, but because trade credit has very different characteristics to the other type of credit, right? Interest rates are different, the penalties are different, so again, that's something else that is left for somebody else to do, looking at effects on trade credit. And finally, the other thing that we're going to exclude is we're going to exclude firms that are on the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. Why do we exclude those firms? The reason why we exclude these firms is because we want to focus on the firms that borrow and not in the firms that are lending. Okay, that's the idea here. Okay, so measurement issues here.
Sorry, but real estate includes developers?
That's going to include developers too. Yeah, which actually would borrow, but we cannot split them. There's no way to, yeah. But yeah, that's a good question.
REITs as well.
Sorry?
Real estate investment trusts. REITs.
Sorry?
REITs. Real estate investment trusts.
Yes, they're here. Right, they're excluded. Yeah, they will be in fire, so they're excluded. So the way to think about this, basically, we're thinking about service sector, right, apart from that, but we're talking lots of it is going to be the manufacturing sector too, manufacturing firms. Other things that we have, so I was talking about the other thing first. So one thing that you would like to see is it would be nice to have data on projects that the firms have, so that you can tell, okay, maybe there's some projects that you end up finally saying, okay, if the monetary policy shock hits and interest rate becomes more expensive, now I'm not going to undergo this project, instead I pick up the other project. We cannot do that, right? Firm entry here, right? The other thing that we see when you get the data from Compustat is that you're going to have firms that enter into the sample, but doesn't necessarily mean that the firm didn't exist before, right? So to adjust also here, what we're going to do is we're going to drop firms that appear for the first time in Compustat, for which the ratio between the end of the period gross capital and the net capital was bigger than 120. So those were firms that just became public. And for firm exit, if you go through Compustat, you have different reasons why a firm might exit the sample. What we're going to keep is we're going to keep the firms that exit because of merger of acquisition, bankruptcy, or liquidation as credit subtraction, but we're not going to include the firms that exit because they were converted to a private company, because they still exist there, right? They were public and now they're private, or if the reason is unspecified, or it was a leverage buyout. So those ones we excluded. How do we aggregate? Okay, so these are the flows that we're going to compute. So we follow the literature on labor flows. What the literature on labor flows does is that if you calculate the average depth of a firm in a quarter, we're going to take quarter T and quarter T minus 1 and divide that, and that's going to be the average debt. And then we're going to do the same thing for subsets of firms. What do I mean by subsets of firms? For instance, the firms that are small or the firms that are large. And then we're going to calculate the rates of growth. Those rates of growth are going to be the rates of growth between period T and T minus 1. Note that when we do that, the same thing as with the labor flows data, these rates of growth are going to be bounded between minus 2 and 2. Okay? So these are the definitions.
Why minus 2?
Because we're taking these averages. So then that's going to bound them between minus 2 and 2.
Okay, you bound because
Yeah.
that can be minus more than minus 1.
Yeah, but there's the rate of growth. Remember that part. Okay, so then the rate of growth, in that case, the maximum you're going to have -2 or +2. That makes it more continuous. Yeah. So what are we going to do? The same thing as with the labor flows. We calculate credit creation, credit destruction, net credit growth, credit reallocation, and excess credit reallocation. Credit creation, the first one. So how do we define it? Basically what it's going to be is take these rate of growth of credit, and we're going to weight them by the share of the debt of the firm on the group that we want. The group could be the aggregate, or the group could be small firms, right? And so that's going to be credit creation. So what is going to be counted here? Basically rates of growth for firms that are expanding or firms that are entering. What is going to be credit destruction? Credit destruction, it's going to be, again, the weight is the same, the debt of the firm over the debt of the group that we're calculating, and we get the absolute value of the rate of growth, right? Because these rates of growth are negative. And so that's going to be the credit destruction. So we have two rates of growth, credit creation, credit destruction. If we subtract the credit destruction from the credit creation, what do you get? The net credit growth. Net credit growth is what most of the papers focus on. They're not going to focus on this part or on this part, right? Credit reallocation. What is credit reallocation going to be? Credit reallocation is going to be the sum of the positive and the negative. And then we have excess credit reallocation, which is going to be the credit reallocation minus the net. What does that mean? Is the credit that you need in excess of what the change in credit was to accommodate the changes in the credit, okay? So these two measures are going to be measures of, you can think about the intensity or the dynamism of the credit market here. So let me show you the data. So on the top figure, what you see is credit creation, which is the solid line, and credit destruction, which is the dashed line. The gray areas are going to be the recessions in the US. And what you can see is you have a lot more dynamism, for instance, in the 80s than in the 70s. And then also in the 90s. And if you look and we zoom in into the area that we want to focus on, the last recession and afterwards the zero lower bound, what we see is a huge increase in credit creation right before the crisis, and then a big drop. And if you look at credit destruction, actually the rate of credit destruction was dropping before the recession, and then it increases during the recession. If you look at credit reallocation, it's going to be the solid line, and let's call it the dotted line, so these two figures here. Again, what you see is the dynamism of the credit market was increasing before the recession. You have this increase in credit reallocation, and it drops dramatically when you have the recession. And then it's sort of stable afterwards. Let me show you something else also for those of you who have looked at labor flows. Right? So if you have looked at labor flows before, you would say, okay, how do these measures compare to labor flows? So if you look at averages, and the average I'm giving you is over the period, we have data for labor flows and the average for the annual labor flows. What you can see is that credit, right? Your rates of growth in credit are much bigger than, for instance, if you look at jobs. They're bigger than if you look at sales or even at physical capital. So there are important amount of credit reallocation here. There's a very dynamic market, and this dynamism changes over time. Coefficient of variation are somewhat bigger, right? If you look at bigger than for the total credit than the long-term credit, that is not surprising because it's the short-term credit that is going to have more volatility and somewhat, think about the same size of the sales. Okay, so hopefully by now you believe me that intensity of credit reallocation is big, right? It varies over the business cycle. It changed a lot before the recession and after the recession. At any phase of the business cycle, you have big inter-firm credit flows that are basically going to exceed those that you need to accommodate the net credit changes. It's important and it's continuous. Okay. Let's focus on what happened during the zero lower bound with monetary policy. So we start December 16, 2008 to December 15. The effective federal funds rate, right, was basically between 0 and a quarter point, right? If we look at the effective federal funds rate, this is how it looks for basically 8 years before it hit the zero lower bound, right? It was increasing, then it dropped. We hit the zero lower bound, and this is the black line. This is the effective rate. If we wanted to look at what happened at unconventional monetary policy, the way we're going to do it is we're going to use the shadow rate that is computed by Zhu and Xia. Okay, so as you can see, the shadow rate goes below 0. It starts here going below 0, and this is the period that is going to be much lower, right? And basically what it's going to allow us to measure is all these unconventional monetary policy measures. That's going to be quantitative easing, part of it that's going to be due also to forward guidance. It's going to be measuring this effect that the policies were having on the long-term interest rates that we would not have seen on the effective rate. So what is the advantage of using this shadow rate? The advantage of using that shadow rate is we can use the same econometric tools that we learn in our other classes in order to estimate what the effects of monetary policy are. So if we had this period here when it hit the zero lower bound, this is not really going to give us a good idea of what the Fed was doing during that time, right? So instead of that, let's use the shadow rate. Okay. So if I show you also during that period of time, there's big changes, right? Those changes in credit during the zero lower bound. This is for short-term credit, but in particular, just look at, for instance, the first row on both of these panels. What you can see is that there's big changes in credit from the end of the zero lower, so from the beginning of the zero lower bound to the end of the zero lower bound, right? Credit creation was increasing, credit destruction decreasing for long-term credit. And if you look at short-term credit, they're about the same rate, so the net didn't change very much, but there was some important reallocation here, and here too. If you roughly look at the data here, in particular, let's focus on the long-term credit differences between the small firms and the long-term large firms, you see big differences here. Okay. So what's the methodology we're going to use here? This is going to be a factor augmented vector autoregression. It's similar in spirit to what Bernanke, Boivin, and Iliasas use. So let's think about this F being the unobservable factors, right? And the R is just going to be our policy instrument. Our policy instrument is going to be the effective federal funds rate when it doesn't hit the zero lower bound, and whenever it hits the zero lower bound, we'll replace it with the shadow rate. Okay? So that's the monetary policy instrument. We're going to relate that to X. What is X? X are going to be series that are observable. We're going to include here 99 time series that include what? Data on labor, data on consumption, data on housing and exchange rate, interest rates. On top of that, we add the credit flows. Why do we want to go this way instead of a regular VAR? The reason we want to go this way instead of a regular VAR is because now we're going to have more information that is available to the policymaker when they're making the decision on what to do with monetary policy, right? So you have lots of variables that are available to the policymaker. What we're going to do is we're going to do what? We need to extract some factors from the observable variables. What we're going to have is we have 3 factors. We have played with more or less factors. The results are not that different. But here we're going to have 3 factors that we extract that are going to be common factors to these X variables here. And then what we need to do is we want to have these factors being orthogonal to the interest rate. So you need to purge them from the effect of the interest rate. Okay? And then your purge factors are going to enter into this VAR part. The VAR part is going to be what? Just the purge factors, the monetary policy instrument, regressed on lags of themselves. And that's it. Okay. What do we do next? The next thing that we want to do is we want to compute impulse responses, right? The same thing that you would do with the VAR. You want to say, okay, if I give a shock, monetary policy shock, what is going to be the response of the economy? So our shock, as you can see here, it's going to be minus 25 basis point decrease in the federal funds rate, because we were thinking about monetary easing. What is the effect of this monetary easing? An increase in industrial production. You have a little bit of what we know as the price puzzle, this effect on the prices here. Capacity utilization is going to increase, unemployment decreases, and your housing starts are going to increase. More importantly, in the two bottom panels, note that two things are happening. Credit destruction is increasing, and credit creation is increasing, right? Credit creation, if we computed the numbers, note that the scale here is different than this scale. So net credit changes are positive because creation is increasing more than the destruction, okay? Which you can see in the next graph here. So if you have monetary policy easing, your net credit change should be positive. That's what we would have expected. But the credit reallocation also increased, right? We have a lot of reallocation of credit, and the excess reallocation also increases. That's historical, right? That's the average over the whole period of the whole sample that I have. But I told you at the beginning that really what I cared was the unconventional part. So let's go to the unconventional part and think.
We're talking about the decrease in interest rates.
We're going to, yeah. Really, because we think about the period of monetary easing, right? But this system is symmetric, which might be a problem, right? So if it wasn't increased, it would look the same thing, but flip it over. And that's it, right? So what is the contribution of the unconventional monetary policy here? So what we do is we're going to look at two counterfactual paths for the period of the zero lower bound. What are the two counterfactuals? What we can do is we could decompose our impulse responses and say, okay, I want to compute the contribution of interest rate changes and changes in the factors, and then I can compute what my historical path would be. But the other thing that I could do, right, is compute what the contribution of just one shock. What is the shock that I'm interested in? The monetary policy shock. So let's calculate the contribution of the monetary policy shocks to the evolution of the different variables that we're interested in here. And let's focus on the credit flows, okay? What's the first counterfactual? The first counterfactual, I'm going to call it a no monetary policy shock counterfactual. What is that equivalent to? This is equivalent to saying, I'm going to make that the shocks equal to zero during the whole period. What is that equal to? To say there was no surprises in monetary policy. The only thing that happened is that the central bank followed the usual monetary policy rule. What is the second counterfactual? Well, you will see that is the interesting one. The second counterfactual is to say, what would have happened if the Federal Reserve would have been constrained by the zero lower bound? So let's eliminate that gap that we had between the shadow rate and the federal funds rate. That's basically what this is done. Okay, so solid line is going to be the historical, the dashed line is going to be the first counterfactual, and the dotted line is the second counterfactual. So when you look at the path of industrial production, basically what this is saying is, okay, so suppose that we don't have any unconventional monetary policy. Had we not had any unconventional monetary policy, industrial production would have been much lower than what we have observed. Unemployment would have been higher. Credit destruction would have been somewhat lower, and credit creation would have been somewhat lower. If I shut the monetary policy shocks, there's a difference there, but really the difference is minimal. I'll have everything for completeness in the tables that I'll show you, but the effect there is not very big. Okay, so what's the other thing that we're going to do? We're going to say, okay, well, there's heterogeneity in the firms here, so how do financial resources get allocated across heterogeneous firms? And so what we're going to do is we're going to partition the firms along several dimensions. Okay, so these are the dimensions we're going to consider. We're going to define split group firms by default probability. I'm going to show you results for the highest tercile and the lowest tercile. Then I'm going to split them by debt service, highest tercile, lowest tercile. By size, and this is based on value asset, age, which is kind of iffy in terms of definition because it's the age defined by Compustat. So 16 years prior to the date of inclusion, all is young, otherwise they're old, and need for external finance. And then we're going to define firms as financially constrained or non-financially constrained depending on these measures. Okay, common measures that people have used, right, for financial. Yeah, that doesn't look that good. Okay, so what I want to show you, let's get through this one instead. Okay, so if we look at their policy counterfactuals, this is the first scenario, this is the second scenario. The first scenario, basically, there's not much, right? You shut down the monetary policy, the wedge between the actual and the counterfactual is basically nothing. Whereas instead, if I had shut down, basically being constrained by the zero lower bound, what would have happened for short-term credit? Basically, what would have happened is that what the zero lower bound, what the unconventional monetary policy did was to make credit creation larger and to avoid some of the credit destruction. So, more importantly, for the long-term credit, basically it avoided some of the, or made the creation of credit larger and the destruction higher. Where do you see the big differences? The biggest differences, for instance, are going to be for high debt firms and also for high default probability firms. So some of the credit was being channeled towards these firms that were more financially dependent. What's the other thing that we look at is we look at different routes of policy, and if I had time to go to the different round of policies, what you will see is, you can see in the paper, is that the first round didn't have that much an effect. Quantitative easing, the second round didn't have that much of an effect. Operation twist, the effect was smaller. Here's where the effect was. It's basically the last round of quantitative easing. You would say to me that's not surprising, right? Because if you remember, I showed you the graph for the difference between the effective federal funds rate and the shadow rate. The gaps are bigger there. So you would expect also the effects to be bigger here. So larger effects are still the same, right? It's going to be for high default firms, high default probability firms. So last 5 minutes or so that I have, I would say, okay, fine. You're saying that unconventional monetary policy should have been channeling resources to those firms that were more financially constrained. We wanted those firms to get some of the credit that we're not getting. But should I worry? Because what's going to happen is most of the effect is focused on the long-term credit. Are these firms that are going to be good in terms of investing or not? What if what the monetary policy did was reshuffling some of the funds towards firms that were not very efficient in investing? Then we should be worried, right? So one of the things
Why are these firms financially constrained to begin with? Because they're risky?
So they could be for different things, right? Some of them could be, that's right, because they have higher default probability. And what actually we're doing is we're reshuffling some of the credit to firms that were high default probability. And therefore, then we should be worried, right?
Exactly.
Exactly. Whereas if you were saying, okay, usually we tend to think that the small and young firms are more financially constrained, but also those are the firms that invest more and that grow more, then that should not be a bad thing, right? Because they're going to invest and they grow more. So that should be okay. Yeah. So what we do here is we calculate some investment efficiency index. Note that this investment efficiency index, what is it going to do? It's going to compare sales to capital, right? So it's weighted sales as percentage of the capital growth between 2 periods of time. So we split them between the ones that are bigger than 1 and smaller than 1. Bigger than 1 are those for which there had capital growth, right? And then we ask the question of which firms were being affected by this unconventional monetary policy. And I think that's probably the part of the paper that is more interesting, is that when you look at these firms, certainly these firms are different, right? When you look about productive versus less productive firms, for productive firms, you have much more credit creation, higher rates of credit creation, right? Lower rates of credit destruction than for the firms that are less productive to start with. Probably we would have expected that, right? if we look at the credit reallocation, and especially if you focus on the long-term credit, which is going to finance this investment, what you're going to see is higher rates of credit reallocation for productive firms versus the non-productive firms. Now, what was the effect of this unconventional monetary policy? What we're going to see is that, again, most of the effect is focused here on the third round of quantitative easing. When you compare productive firms versus non-productive firms, so for short-term credit, what you see is that unconventional monetary policy increased the creation of credit for these firms that were more productive. And the other thing that it did was that it also increased the creation of credit for these firms that were for the productive firms for the long-term credit. So in that sense, that's a positive thing, right? Because it should foster investment and it should foster growth. And when you remember the numbers that I gave you for what the averages were during this period of time, these changes are not small, right? Effect on the less productive firms, much lower. Okay, so minutes to conclude. So what does this paper, what are we doing in this paper? Basically, if you look at this unconventional monetary policy, it had considerably large and persistent effects also on allocation of credit among the firms. Where is the effect? Mainly is on the long-term credit. And when we looked at were they effective in easing financial constraints, it was. In some of the cases, maybe you would have think a priori not a positive way if there was this high default probability firms. The only thing we're saying, well, it's positive in the sense that if you look at short-term credit and long-term credit, it increased substantially more for the productive firms. So that should give you a moment of respite and say, okay, well, at least it was working in the direction that we wanted it to work. So there's where I say, okay, if you had Lebanese data for firms, you could ask the same question, right?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Let's take a few questions and then we can go ahead.
So I have a question regarding the model. The observable variable, you only put the interest rate, the shadow rate, as observable, and everything else are unobservable factors, including the exchange rate. And so why not including the exchange rate and the industrial production, the aggregate measures, why they're not in the block of the observable variable?
So we are to some degree, right? Because what we're doing is we're extracting the common factors from all those variables, right? So to some degree, those things are in there. One of the things that we have learned over years of looking at monetary policy papers is that sometimes these FAVER papers do a better job at showing us the effect and estimating the monetary policy effects than just the VAR. So if we went the other way, then you start saying, okay, I'm going to start increasing the dimension of the VAR by how many variables, right? And then you have this problem of dimensionality.
Yes, definitely. So the only thing was, why not really moving those to the observable block and then keep the credit flows only in the unobservable factor block?
We don't want to do that, right? And the reason we don't want to do that is because we want to trace the effect in here. So the credit flows are in there with all the other credit variables. We could try.
Because in other papers usually so for example in the paper that we have on job flows, we basically put some aggregate variables as observables, observable variables block.
We could. So we're rotating only on the observables, the sector ones. Okay, when we're disaggregated.
The concern would be identification of these, observable variables.
As long as we have the monetary policy down, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, in this case, yeah.
Yeah.
And then also because monetary policy, the Federal Reserve monetary policy has changed over time. So wouldn't it be a way to do some time varying factor augmented beyond possibly?
So one thing you can think about is, you can be whether it's time varying. If you look at the and one of the things that we were looking just last week, if you look at the monetary policy shocks during this time, even before that, I would say that they're still within the range that would allow you to think that that hasn't changed that much, okay? And there's lots of work on the things that Wan Xia had done where it shows that you don't see that much change in the structure. So you could look for a structural break. You don't have enough data there, right, at the end to try to do lots of tests, but it seems like if you shorten the data, the sample, and have less factors, you still get the same impulse response functions. So yeah, that hasn't changed that much.
Okay, thank you first of all, it's great to have you here. Just one question about the monetary policy shock. I've seen this being done in many different ways. So one way is to look at a Taylor rule, for example, and then measure monetary policy shocks from that. Another is now that in the finance literature, they're saying since April 2011, you have to account for the summary of economic projections. So there are, my impression sometimes is that there's more information in that period of unconventional monetary policy than summarized by the shadow rate. So do you think that's a factor that should be? So
yeah, for sure. So as I said before, we just finished doing this round. This is like the first draft of the paper that we have written, and really, yeah, one of the things that we should look, for instance, about what is the role of just the announcements, right? That, yeah.
You would control for that by just having.
So you could look at the dates of the announcements.
Okay, so dummy variance.
So and then you can project that into the rate. Another way that it's possible, and that'll be interesting to look at, is also because what they were doing is really they were affecting the whole term structure, right? So you have a way to do, instead of just this impulse response that is one shock, you can think about functionals of shocks that are going to shift your whole, right? The whole term structure, the yield curve, then they'll be more interesting. The problem is, like we've been facing in this, is this data from Compustat is quarterly, right? So it's already very aggregated. So in the cases where you have, so there's a question there, right? When you use monthly data and you have only one shock on one announcement per month, which is tend to be the case, then it's relatively easy to do. Once you have more than one announcement or one event per quarter, then you have to think about what is the best way of aggregating things there. And that's where we are.
If we suppose that a crisis happens, what will happen to students? What will change? How will they pay their fees?
That I don't have a clue.
Question, Nasser, please go ahead.
Sorry, just regarding the identification scheme of the model, you are using the orthogonality between the unobservable and the observable.
That's right.
This is your scheme.
Yes.
And the other thing regarding the effect of credit crunch. Yeah, usually, did you take it like into consideration just to affect like usually sometimes the central bank will pump the money and actually the bank are not interested to lend them out because they are afraid of the.
I agree. So we cannot see that right now the way we have.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah.
But
yeah, that we don't know. And the other thing that you have to remember is that here, when we're looking at debt, this debt is not only loans from the banks, right? This debt also could be paper that is issued by the firm. That's another thing. And clearly, one thing that we saw in the U.S. during this period of time was that firms that had the ability to issue commercial paper started issuing more commercial paper and getting less bank loans.
Other questions?
What happened in QE3 that was not happening in QE1 and QE2, so that we started having some effect on the real economy?
That's a good question, and I don't know. Yeah, and I don't know the answer yet. So, because part of it might be just a matter of how big the gap was, right? You're just having the shocks that are bigger in this period of time, and that's what we're looking at now, right? You just need to be shocking the economy much more to get this big wedge in there.
But monetary policy was not changing; it was the same over the.
It was so again, you're buying more long-term. So that is true. So there you're buying more long-term bonds at this time. They were focusing more on the long-term market. So that's one thing.
Forward guidance?
And that was forward. But forward guidance also covers some of, it depends on how you see it, right? Because there were announcements even before. It might have covered some of the period before. Yeah.
Were they aware of this? Were they aware of this, that the third round would be the most efficient? Or are they just trying trial and error and then QE3?
I don't think they were necessarily aware that that would be the most effective round in terms of credit. A priori, I don't think so. But they knew what they were doing, right? They knew which part of the yield curve they wanted to affect at that point. That was clear.
Yes, the increase or decrease in the federal fund rates was 0.25%. What would be the effect of a higher change in the basis points?
Multiply it.
We took it for granted that the Fed is going to come up every press conference and change 0.25 base or 25 basis points.
In this model, multiply it by whatever it is.
Would the effect be the same?
So if you do it in this model, 0.25, instead of 0.25, you do 0.5, it will be twice this effect, because we're assuming that the effects are linear, right?
So,
And what would be the effect of deleveraging the Fed balance sheet on the entire process?
Okay, so that part we haven't done, right? Because we just looked at the initial part. That's another thing that we could look at more data. Yeah, I agree. The more data that you have, you could look at that period, and then you could actually test whether the effect were symmetric or not, because there's no reason why they might have been symmetric.
yeah, I just wanted to ask about what if a positive shock would you expect it to give like different responses? I mean, in this model, I know it's symmetric,
but I don't. That's something that we should investigate. It might not be necessarily symmetric, right? In some of the things that Mohammed and I have looked at, is not necessarily even just symmetric positive versus negative, but also whether it's symmetric in creation and destruction, and you get different degree of reallocation of resources with a positive or a negative shock. Yeah. So yeah, that's something to look into.
So basically the estimation was done on a sample that started from 1974 all the way to 2017, and then the monetary policy rule has, so like you have the Volcker period in there, you have the Great Moderation in there, and then you're estimating throughout the whole period, and then you're doing your historical decomposition and then counterfactual for the QE3 and QE2. So, for example, if you start your sample, let's say after the Volcker,
we need to check.
Okay.
Yeah, we still need to check that. Yeah.
I guess with this we will take a 5-minute break and then go to the other papers. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me here. Like with Anna, this actually pressured me to, I knew I had to derive, I presented this paper several times, there was some feedback I had gotten the first time, and so things I wanted to look at, and I had done that work, but I hadn't written it up, and so presenting here forced me to finally write it up, so excuse me if some of these transparencies have typos and things like that. So it's called Shipping to Good Apples Under Strategic Competition, and you may not know what the Shipping to Good Apples effect is, but you may have experienced it or have observed it locally. So the Alkene-Allen theorem, as it's known as shipping to good apples, because of a famous paper by Borchegay and Silverberg, and Silverberg's spelled incorrectly, JP 78, and there's a local Washington, so Washington State produces apples for consumption, and someone wrote into the local Washington State newspaper seeking help, and their question was, why are Washington apples in local markets so small and old looking? The dried up stems might seem they were taken out of cold storage from some gathered last year. Where do these big delicious apples go? Are they shipped to Europe, to the East, or can they be bought here in Seattle? So this is sort of the idea of that there's something produced. This thing that's produced has unintended different levels of quality, good quality apples and lower quality apples. And then for some reason why you cannot find the good quality apples locally, it all seems to be exported. And a lot of places have presented this. There's people from different countries, there's products they think about. I think Lebanon's more of a entrepot, so it's more retrade. So I don't know if that's experience of any product here in Lebanon, but things like that. So they only see the bad apples at home, and consumers are not happy about this. They're very proud of what their country produces or their area produces, and they don't see that. Only theorists like me were excited about it until about 15 years ago. Hummels and Skiba had a JPE paper to use this to test on trade data whether you could see this or not. And so what is exactly and why you might see it in the trade data. So the Alkin-Allen effect is that in a competitive market, a common charge on two substitute goods leads to a relative increase in consumption of the higher to lower quality product. Well, what that means is that you have good apples and bad apples, and to ship them from Seattle, Washington to, say, New York City, they both incur exactly the same transport costs, right? And if you have perfectly elastic supply and the prices are reflecting that, then in the price in New York City will be both the good quality apples and the bad quality apples go up by the same per unit charge, right? Therefore, the relative price of the good quality apples is now cheaper compared to the bad quality apples. And so the relative demand for the high quality apples is increased, and there's conditions in which this occurs, and that's the Alkin-Allen effect. And so what Hummels and Skiba did was to look in the trade data to see if this you can see this in it, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. But there are many examples in competitive markets about this. So roses in Tanzania mainly go to Europe, and lower quality roses go to the domestic market. Coffee in Indonesia, where the locals get the leftover. I happen to know that in Colombia for a long time, people viewed that the lower quality coffee was that way. Actually, I recently presented it in this from Honduras, and his father actually owned lumber, and the better quality lumber gets shipped out and the lower quality lumber stays in. Mangoes in India. And I think part of the reason why this theorem is known is it resonates, and I started on a project with Thomas Scheizko where we're looking at sort of the informational story, but in finding stories about this, one of the things I realized is that it's not just a competitive phenomenon. So not all examples that appear competitive are. So for example, for Colombia, there's the Juan Valdez coffee, and they actually market within the US. And there's actually a Harvard case study about how they actually have market power within the US. So coffee you might think is being close to perfectly competitive, it may not be. In Tanzania, flower production is actually vertically integrated. That is, the growers in Tanzania are in charge of the shipping and distribution within Europe of those flowers as well. So it's an integrated thing, so not competitive. And there's other examples of bad apples. So Bordeaux and other wineries have first and second growths. And the idea is the high quality grapes are the higher price and the low quality grapes are the lower price. And then so you can think about this wine grower in Bordeaux has this issue of how much of the first growth versus the second growth they want to ship to the US or to other countries within Europe or to Australia, and how much they want to keep home. Right? And the thing is, of course, is that people they know that the second growth is not as good quality as the first growth, but the second growth is also cheaper. And when you export more of the second growth, it will cannibalize the sales of the first growth a bit. Right? People have this other option. It's going to push down the second growth price. And of course, still feedback at home as well. And I'm a game theorist, and these are the kind of things that interest me and excited. And for example, in the United States, factory refurbished on Amazon actually often includes what are seconds. So in production seconds, they grade the quality of the produced product, electronic product, and sometimes they're listed as second. And there actually are these stores all over the world where basically they sell lots of seconds, right? So products that were on a production line were not intended to be considered lower quality, or ideally you'd like that all be high quality, but exogenously some fraction of there is seconds. And that's what I'm interested in, a sort of strategic environment. And I guess the key question here is that, are you going to still see this shipping the good apples when firms start thinking about the feedback of exporting the good apples may have on the prices in the foreign markets as well in the domestic market? So in the US, you can actually find importation of low quality through the Sierra Trading Post. So different products that you might not think about have seconds. So kayaks, espresso machines. You can save 54% on this espresso machine. You can actually Google factory seconds of different products. And for A, you get appliances. I typed in B, bumper plates, which if you weight lift, that's the weights on there. Bullets. So I never knew this, but bullets actually have factory seconds. And here is a store that has factory outlet seconds on bullets. And you'll be happy to know this is in the south of the US, and it's actually closed for Good Friday. So they don't sell bullets on Good Friday, but otherwise they'll sell bullets any day of the week. And I didn't realize bullets actually are branded products. So I don't hunt. I lived in Michigan for a long time. I never hunted, but yes, bullets are a branded product. So there are factory seconds there as well. And then I started thinking about it, and I'm an informational person, and I started thinking that actually in retail, in a way, there is firsts and seconds. And in particular, when a retailer, say, has a new sweater line, has different colors or different cuts of the sweater, they don't know beforehand which ones will be successful and which one will not be successful. I mean, they have some ideas, right? But it turns out that some are good, some are bad. And in fact, what you have is that you can imagine that the customer goes into the store, they see the price, they don't really think it's a really high quality product after all, and they actually know that they can wait and actually go to the outlet store instead to buy that product. And in fact, a lot of the name brand stores like Neiman Marcus, Nordstrom, in Spain, Desigual, Mango, actually have outlets where the stuff that does not sell initially, that consumers view as being lower quality, not deserving that price, and also knowing that the lower price will be later on, go to those outlet stores and and in fact, there's a whole wiki invest on off-price retail, which this quote for here takes advantage of overruns, canceled orders, and forecasting mistakes, right? Not understanding what consumer preferences will be in this. When Ralph Polo Lauren miscalculates consumer preferences and overproduces, it'll send the excess to TJ Maxx. So in other words, ex ante for a firm, it knows that some of those products will be viewed as high quality and they can sell at the higher price, but some consumers are not going to be willing to buy at the higher price. They'll have to send it to the outlet. It'll be effectively treated as a low. And there's estimates that overstocks annually are $1.5 trillion worth, so it's not small. Now, of course, overstock, so maybe I'm giving you a stock, not a flow here, but as a flow, Russia's GDP is roughly that size. So I'm not sure I believe either of these numbers, but that's there. So, and actually in the contracts, on the overstocks, often there are requirements that when they sell them, they have to be exported in this case. So there's another place where you have high and low quality exogenously exposed, at least to the producers. And so this is what I want to investigate. Non-competitive markets with bad apples. And here now we're thinking about the producer choosing where they want to send it and thinking about the feedback and where they send it. And they have market power. They compete strategically. It's internationally traded, so the markets will be segmented. And not previously studied. And actually, I came to this wanting to examine this under uncertainty, where people didn't know about the quality. And then I realized that no one had written this with certainty before. So this paper had to be written first before I could go to my next paper. All right. So apples with Cornell competition. It's about individual demand. Here are those feedbacks I'm talking about, and a couple of questions I want to ask is, remember, the consumers were unhappy about those apples, the good apples not being around, so one of the things I want to look into there. And in trade models with linear costs, there is no effect from exporting. Right? With linear marginal costs, the markets are traded separately, and if a firm decides to start exporting a product, it doesn't affect the domestic market, consumers are no worse off. However, if the firm has convex costs of production, so you think about quadratic costs, if you start exporting, that actually means there's going to be less left home. And so maybe this is why consumers are unhappy about the exportation, is that it actually is less product at home altogether. So that's what I want to investigate, and more generally about choices and welfare effects when there's trade with unintended quality variation. Right? So I'm an IO person. There's a lot of things on quality choice with complete information and what they want to do. In these cases, there is some work back in the 90s and early aughts on trade and quality, but these are all about single quality choices. And there is recently, Peter Neary, of course, is sort of the strategic trade person on product selection and trade, but for the most part in the trade literature, it's all about the monopolistically competitive market and not in strategic settings. All right, so what I'm going to present is a simple framework. So in your strategic trade, your Brander and Spencer model, basically the Brander and Spencer model is a model where there's two countries that export to a third country. That third country doesn't have production. The two firms in each of the producing countries have a monopoly position, so they can prevent resales back into their country. I extend it to N+1 countries because one of the things I want to look at is the limit properties. So the idea here is that as N gets very large, I'll move to a competitive equilibrium. And so hope that in the competitive equilibrium, I can get back with a constant production, I can get back the shipping good apples if it disappears. So here, end countries have one firm in each. I'm going to refer to the representative firm as domestic, the other producing firms as the foreign firms, and they all go to the export country. They're going to produce a product. There's going to only be 2 quality levels. The product, they wish it all would turn out to be high quality because consumers are going to be willing to pay more for it. However, an end-to-end fraction are going to turn out to be low quality. The ones that consumers don't want to buy, the ugly color sweaters, the ugly apples, and low quality. Complete information after production. So once they produce it, the firms see which one are high quality, which are low quality. I said monopoly at home, so no arbitrage. And they're going to compete in quantity competition. Consumers will just draw on the basic modeling of quality and consumer choices. So that's something else going on here, is that actually thinking about how the consumers trade off on the different quality levels. And so as a mass consumers normalized to 1, they each have unit demands. They only want to buy 1 unit of the product. S represents the quality level, and theta I represents consumers' I's preference for quality. So the idea then is that for higher theta I means you value quality more. So everyone here agrees about the ranking, right? What's a better quality product, what's a lower quality product? What people disagree about is how much more you're willing to pay for the better quality product, right? So I agree that a BMW SUV is much nicer than a Kia SUV, but am I willing to pay the higher price for the BMW one versus some people are, some people aren't. And the other key thing here is we can think of it as Maya and Johnson have shown that a better way of thinking about it sometimes is quality upgrades. That the Kia is one car, and buying the BMW, you're actually buying a quality upgrade is the way to think about it. And so higher theta I's are willing to pay more for that quality upgrade in this case. Or the classic example is between tourist class, nicer tourist class, business class, and first class in those. So let me show a graph of the demand. It'll be uniform, so it'll be linear, so you can understand some of the dynamics here. So exogenous QH high quality units here, QL low quality units. So the total production is this amount here on the market, and this is the amount that's high quality, and this is the amount that'll be low quality. And then, for example, here is SH, the high quality product, and this goes all the way out to 1. And the idea here is that the consumer with the highest theta is willing to pay the most for the highest quality and also the most for the lowest quality, right? But they're willing to pay more for the higher quality. So this is all the different consumers' demand for high quality. This is all the consumers' demand for low quality. And then how the market sorts is, you can see, is that, well, the first unit, the consumers who are willing to pay the most for high quality are willing to pay the most for the upgrade. And so the way the market will sort is that as you move down here, consumers are willing to pay less and less for an upgrade. And so you can figure out how the market clears by, well, the total production, that will clear where the marginal consumer is just willing to pay for low quality. And so that you can pin down the market price for low quality here at PL. The price for high quality, right? The marginal consumer who's just willing to buy high quality, that consumer is going to buy high quality in equilibrium, but they of course could have bought low quality instead, right? So they had to be just indifferent between the high and low quality, which means that even though they're willing to pay this price if high quality was the only product out there, right? Because they could have bought the low quality, right? Which had a price pinned down by the marginal consumer here, and their value of it was here, their surplus was here for the low quality. And so therefore, to get them to be willing to buy the high quality, the price has to be less than their alternative, their opportunity cost of buying the high quality, right? And here you can see very nicely how low quality production can cannibalize the sales of high quality production, right? So for example, if we expand QL, there's more and more low quality production holding high quality production constant, the price for low quality drops down as a result. But of course, as the price for low quality drops down, that means that the marginal consumer here, who's still the same, is getting more surplus if they choose low quality. And so therefore, the high quality price has to drop down. So for the retail stores, one issue they have is that, by having these outlets and consumers knowing these outlets, to convince the consumer to buy their high quality product, these outlets actually force them to offer a lower price on the high quality. And you read a lot of articles about the cannibalization of sales in this case. All right, so I just showed you with the graph, and then you can pin down the prices here. They'll look like this. And then here's a consumer surplus for the low quality, for the high quality, triangle here, and I wrote it here so you can see it's the premium there. So firms are going to choose Q, and they're also going to choose how much of the high quality production they want to export and how much of the low quality production they want to export. So 3 choices for each firm. Marginal cost production C. I want to assume production for low quality is efficient. And then subscripts will indicate location, superscripts indicate the high or low quality. So here's the domestic firm. Z is going to refer to the dud rate, so the fraction that turns out to be low quality in this case. So before going to the oligopoly version, there's some interesting dynamics in a monopoly version to see. So here is the monopoly firm's profits. Here was the price expression for the monopolist firm. Here's the fraction of its production that turns out to be high quality, and this is how much it chose to produce. Here is going to be the price for low quality. Here's the fraction of duds and what it produces. So it's only producing at home, simple autarky, nothing going on here. It maximizes, and you can figure out how much it wants to produce. Roughly, this is the expected quality, less cost of production, divided by the expected quality and the low margin because of the premium you have to pay for low quality. Right. So there's a couple of interesting comparative statics here. So another reason to look at it. The first one is that production can be increasing in the value of low quality. So we pin down this, we have some SH and SL, and the reason why a firm may actually choose to produce less as SL increases. So one thing you can think about is that, well, maybe firms, they're going to have duds, but they want to make sure they're better duds in some sense. And that can actually be bad for the firm, because as SL rotates up and people value SL better, well, that means again that marginal consumer, low quality now looks better. And so that alternative now looks better. And so in some sense, one reason why you might see outlet stores further away and things like that is sort of impose cost on consumers, so that alternative doesn't look quite as good. So there is a reason actually to lower that. And the other sort of interesting comparative static here is that output can be increasing in the dud rate. So as you have more duds, you may want to increase output. And again, what's occurring there is that as you have more low quality resulting, that means you have less high quality, and you may want to expand output to get more high quality on the market. So here is profits, and those 2 previous comparative statics I mentioned here is that it actually turns out that increases in that low quality could actually reduce profits for the firm. Right? So the firm has reasons to make the duds less attractive, and if you ever studied Musa and Rosen's quality discrimination, there's sort of this enlargement of quality spectrum is sort of the intuition behind there. Now, that was maybe not so surprising. What is maybe more surprising is that when you go to consumer surplus, it turns out that in this case, consumer surplus is just basically half a monopoly profit. And so it actually turns out, from consumers' point of view, an increase in SL can actually be bad news for them as well. That means actually sort of minimum quality standards can have a negative effect on consumer welfare. Why? Because it causes the firm to produce less, and so overall the consumers are worse off, even though the low quality product is a better quality product. Okay. So that's just a benchmark, but I now want to get to the main results about what happens with the shipping the good apples. So I already had briefly outlined it. So now the firm is choosing how much high quality at home. There'll be some price based on it, how much low quality at home, how much it wants to export to the other market. As a result, now the price in the other market is going to depend upon what all the other firms choose as well. How much it's going to export of the low quality other market, cost of production and everything it produces. And now here T, the per unit tax on its production, which actually can also have a public economics interpretation where there are different tax rates in different states or different countries or different regions as well. Unfortunately, because each firm has 3 choice variables and there's basically 6 markets from each firm's point of view, getting a closed form solution I haven't been able to do, or a more generalized solution. So what I do is I make the export market just scaled by K relative to the domestic market, so K can be greater or less than 1. in this case. So if K is greater than 1, basically in the export market, consumers have a greater willingness to pay for high quality and for low quality. All right. There are the choices. Yes, they are expressions. The first thing to note here is that transport costs increase. It can actually have the fraction of high quality good exported decreases. In this case, what's going on here, and I only bring up this lemma because it'll give you the intuition for everything later on, right? When K is less than 1, the export market doesn't value either high quality or low quality as much as the domestic market. However, it's not so much that they value it less, is that when K is less than 1, what any consumer is willing to pay for the quality upgrade is actually smaller as well. And so what that means when K is less than 1 is as you increase the transport costs, that when you export a high quality unit to that other market, relative to what the price would be for the low quality, you're not going to get as much as you would have domestically. And so as the transport cost goes up, you don't want to export as much of the high quality product. However, on the other way around, when they have a greater willing pay for the upgrade, then you do want to. So actually, when transport costs go up, and K is greater than 1, the fraction of your high quality exported actually goes up, right? You're exporting more of your total. Now, this is going to play a role. Sorry, so I'm still not familiar with my new transparencies. Okay, so one question you might think about then here is that I made an assumption that the export market was scaled up on both high and low quality. And so a different thing you might be saying to me is that, well, maybe what's really going on here is that it's higher income market, for example. People are just willing to pay more, so you send a higher quality product to that market. That's what's going on here instead. My intuition was that wasn't right. That was about the the upgrade premium. And so I've just finished solving for the case where I keep the high quality export market the same as the domestic. The export market only differs by K for low quality. So K greater than 1 means that the export market is willing to pay more for low quality than the home market, but they're still willing to pay the same for the high quality, though it has to be capped that low quality doesn't become better than high quality in the export market. And in that case, the sign's reverse. So it actually reflects the quality upgrade story, not that the general income is greater. So in that case, when K is greater than 1, right, as transport costs increases, the fraction of high quality good exported decreases, right? So even though that economy has overall greater average willing to pay for the product, as transport costs go up, you send less high quality. Why? Because the premium you can get for high quality there is less, which is sort of suggesting through all this that we might get a reversal of the shipping to good apples. That because the premium is what's going to matter, that as transport costs go up, you may actually see less high quality being exported. And in fact, that's what I find, right? That if K is sufficiently small, right, that the shipping to good apples theorem doesn't hold here, right? That as transport costs go up, the firm is actually going to ship relatively less high quality than low quality product as a result. And again, it's not driven by the greater willingness to pay, so I haven't quite folded these in as neatly as I'd like to, where again with the alternative setting, K has to be greater than a certain amount to not get the shipping to good apples, or rather the shipping to bad apples as a result. So first of all, okay, I find that we might not get shipping to good apples once we move away from a competitive environment and a strategic environment instead. But the other question then is, well, what happened to relative prices through all this? And what's interesting, oops, see, I'm still not using my transparencies. I'll come back to that in a second then. No? Oh, here it is, yes. I thought I had it in my transparency somewhere, but apparently not. Oh, wait, here. No, nowhere here. So I'll have to tell you what happens. So what about relative prices in this case? So remember, the firm is choosing how much of the high and low quality it wants to export. And so we see that under these conditions, for example, here, you're going to have less high quality exported. So you might be thinking, well, what's happening in that case is that the relative price for high quality in that foreign country as transport costs go up is actually going up. All right? But no, the answer is no. Actually, the relative price effect part of the alkene allen still holds that imposing a higher tax, you're still having a higher price, but the firm is going to adjust so that the relative higher quality is decreasing in all those cases. So that's actually potentially something you could see in the data, right? So going back to, so one is, Hummels and Skiba find support for shipping to good apples. Right? So the question is, can you find evidence for certain products with market power where you don't see it? So that'd be a sign of that. And second, you might still see though that the relative prices decrease as a relative quantity demanded for high quality. Mm-hmm. So the final question then. So the other thing here, again, what I've just recently did is that, well, what about as N becomes large? So as N, you have a large number of countries all exporting to this. You can think of that as trying to find a competitive limit in this case. And I haven't proved this yet, but as N goes to infinity, the reversal of the shipping to good apples does disappear. Right, so this model would include the case of the alkene allen, which is perfectly competitive markets with perfectly elastic supply, which would occur in this case because they have constant production. So in the limit, you go to competitive, you get the shipping to good apples. Once you're away from the limit, N becomes small, the possibility of not shipping to good apples, but rather shipping to good bad apples occurs instead. So the other major thing in this paper is to turn to welfare and what's going to occur there. An interesting thing that happens in both the variations of the model is that start with autarky, right? We had the original firm, monopoly, they're not trading at all. As I mentioned before that typically with constant marginal cost of production, trade doesn't do anything. With quadratic cost of production, trade is actually bad for domestic consumers because they get less of the product as a result. And I thought that this constraint might do a similar thing. But instead, actually shipping the apples in this case, always increases consumer surplus. Right? The only case it doesn't is when the two countries are identical and there's zero transportation costs. So identical countries, positive transportation costs, zero transportation costs, identical countries. In all those cases, domestically, consumer surplus goes up. And the intuition of what's going on here is that the firm is constrained, right? It's producing, it can choose how much to produce, it can choose how much to export of each type of quality good, but it understands that, well, if I export more of the low quality second growth wine, it's going to reduce the price of my first growth wine in that country I'm exporting to. On the other hand, as I export more of that low quality second growth wine to it's going to raise the price of the second growth wine at home, and as a result, raise the price of the first growth wine at home as well. So all these things are interacting. So how is the firm going to move on this? Well, there's sort of two different things going on with this constraint. The first is that when you really want to sell to the export market, the high quality, so that the K is greater than this threshold K star, right? They really value high quality there. So you want to sell more high quality to them, but the only way you can really do, one thing you can do is your current production, just export more of it, but for that reason you have incentive to increase production, right? And you're going to increase production to export more of your high quality product there, but as you increase production, you're getting more of the low quality as a byproduct in this case. And so what's happening then is that it actually turns out that in these cases, domestically, there's more on the market. Right? To get more of the high quality product exported, you end up with more high and low quality products domestically, less high quality products than there would be in autarky. Right? So on that margin, it's worse, but consumers are better off because more low quality product domestically means a lower low quality price, which means a lower high quality price in response to that. So trying to push against this constraint helps consumers when K is greater than K star. I sort of feel like Dr. Pangloss because when you go the other direction, it's still good for consumers because in this case, the firm doesn't want to ship the good apples, but it still wants to sell the bad apples to this country, the export country. And so it still wants to increase production, but as a result, more good apples stay at home. And so compared to autarky, consumers have more good apples than they have bad apples. And as a result, either way, consumers are better off. Okay. So Now, in presentation, one of the nice things that Humboldt and Skibble show is that they actually show that if instead of a per unit tariff as I had here, what if you have ad valorem, right, a percentage markup on the sale? And they actually show that if the per unit tariff is strictly positive, an increase in the ad valorem tariff increases, the quantity demand for a high quality good decreases. You get shipping the bad apples in that case. And interestingly here, I don't argue with them. I get the exact same result they have. So the ad valorem has the same effect as before. As I said, I've been still in presentations thinking about different directions of taking this. So another extension is that what if there are differing dud rates as well? Solving that I've not been able to do. Examples I've created, I haven't found anything particularly interesting there. And so part of my presentation is also to feedback for people's thoughts about what might be interesting to explore or not explore. So to summarize, this constraint on firms that some of their product is high quality, some of their product is low quality, exists for firms. There's not been much theoretical study of this with multiple qualities. And some of the key results is that, well, minimum quality standards, for example, could actually be bad for consumers in this environment as a result, because it actually causes the firm, if its low quality product has to have a higher standard, it actually may produce less of the total production, and therefore consumers overall are worse off. Second, that we could actually see increase in transportation costs lead to shipping the bad apples instead of the good apples. So one thing to look for in data is whether we see this as a result. And the final thing is that consumers may not like that they can't find a good quality product around. Because again, remember what's occurring here is that they're producing more, so there's more bad quality around than there would have been before, and less good quality than before. So in some sense, finding good quality becomes harder as a result. So that part still exists here, but actually they're better off because they get lower prices.
So you get under point number 3.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain, are those standards in the domestic?
So that I did more with the monopoly one, but let me go back to here.
Minimum standards.
So the interpretation would be here. So right now, low quality has this value SL, right? So what if there were some minimum standard saying that you're going to force it?
Manufacturing country or in the import?
So here I only did it for the autarky case. So for the autarky case, if you increase SL as a result, the firm will decrease production, right? But again, in the export case, that may be true as well, right? That increasing that may cause the firm to actually decrease it. So minimum quality standards on importation can also have this effect as well. And there's a slight literature about minimum quality standards and the effect they have in this case. So a couple of things I would thinking about what to look into or not to look into is that asymmetry between the different producing countries and finding anything interesting there or not. So in particular, maybe having weaker home demand in this scenario could actually be better, because if you have weaker home demand, in some sense, you don't care about the lost profit so much domestically, about having maybe more bad apples around. And so therefore you can be more aggressive. In some sense, there's a lower cost of that domestically. And so weak home demand may actually be a strategic advantage for a firm. So that's one place I want to take it. As I said, it's a difficult problem to solve, at least for me. Maybe smarter people probably not. So one possibility is to fix production and then just see for a given production, and then you can generalize in other dimensions. However, one of the things I didn't mention there is that holding output constant, you don't get shipping the bad apples. So if you fix the output choice and you only have what fraction of high and low quality, you only get shipping the good apples. So actually the production response is part of what's resulting in that. The Brander and Krugman sort of another classic trade paper where the countries, here I have them all sending it to an export country, but what if the countries are exporting to each other, right? And then could there be standard effects? And then the other thing I'm thinking about is instead of having more countries, and I had to extend it to n firms, n countries, basically just have 2 countries producing, but within each country have a large number of firms and take the competitive limit that way instead, and see if you get the shipping to bad apples instead. So, thank you in this case.
I was just wondering, like, can you incorporate like competitive advantage in terms of cost of producing, having lower costs?
One thing when I skipped here is that some people ask about endogenizing the dud rates, whether they can make investments for that. And what you might think about is there may be a trade-off on production costs versus dud rates that. And that might be a comparative advantage. Well, is it or is it not a comparative advantage, right? That or technologically within different countries, some may have lower production costs but higher dud rates. So that's another direction I'm thinking about, whether there could be advantages or even a strategic advantage as a result of that. And so if it's symmetric, you need comparative advantage. If it's symmetric, it won't be very interesting because you can endogenize Z, but in equilibrium, if everyone's symmetric, they're all going to choose the same level of Z as a result, and nothing interesting. So you'd have to do something asymmetric, but then solving it starts becoming harder because now I've added another choice variable. But it's somewhere to think about in this case.
But not all firms ship the bad apples, right? Some of them destroy them.
So that's something. That's something. So that's actually a good point. And for time, I cut it off. But so one question is would they want to destroy some of that low quality, right? Instead. And that is a really good question. And if someone had brought it up at that point, I would have mentioned it. But one thing I show is intuitively the idea is you have to be able to commit to destroy it. So one variation of the monopoly model I solve is one where they first, they produce, they have some high quality, they have some low quality. They first put the high quality onto the market and let the market clear. And then in the second period, they then choose the low quality. And the question is, would they actually choose to destroy some of that low quality? And it's a commitment problem. Once you get to the second period, they always would want to sell all their low quality, right? So yes, in fact, they may want to destroy some, but they would have to commit to be able to. So then the question is, how do you commit? And it turns out I looked into this, and committing to destroy, there's not free disposal. So in graduate micro, you learn about free disposal, but free disposal is actually an assumption of convenience to avoid problems. So even if the firm could commit, there is no free disposal. For one thing, you have to dispose it. You could sell it to the disposaler, and they might sell it instead. So Gucci may have the bad bags, and in fact, there's this company in Hong Kong, and they have their whole thing is about destroying it. They said, imagine one day you're walking down a busy street full of vendors. Suddenly you notice something, your company's flagship product, luxury handbags, is being sold by a random merchant you've never met. These are the same bags you rejected in an earlier order from your supplier. So you can reject bags, say that low quality I don't want there, I want it destroyed. And how do you know that manufacturer is actually going to destroy it or not? All right? So in fact, you wouldn't be surprised that this company is actually what offered the services of monitoring destruction, right? Industrial shredders, steamrollers for electronic devices, and of course, lawyers to be there to witness all this. And well, this company exists, so this is not free, as you can imagine. So I went back and if you can introduce a relatively small destruction cost, and yes, you'd like to get rid of it, even if you could commit. But in that case, you do have the problem of it's too costly for you. But of course, it's also true there can be cases where destruction costs are low enough that you do go ahead and destroy it. But that's right.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.